Even at our lowest point, God can raise us up. Even at our lowest point, God can raise us up. One of the earliest memories that I have from growing up took place on a hot, sunny summer day. I don't remember exactly how old I was, but I was pretty little. And the subdivision that I grew up in had a subdivision community pool. So on days like this, my parents would usually take me and we would go swimming. But this particular day, I was pretty good friends with the neighbor boy across the street. And so he and his parents were going to the pool. They invited me to come along, so I did. Now at this point in my learning how to swim journey, I was doing all right. Like I had graduated past the little arm floaties. I didn't have to wear those in the pool anymore. But I was still kind of confined to the shallow end of the pool. Like I needed to be in a place where I could stand up and touch because, after swimming for a little bit, you kind of get tired. I'd get worn out, so I need to be able to stop and catch my breath. Couldn't tread water super well yet. So I stayed on the shallow end of the pool. Well, this particular day, I was using the kickboard, and I decided I was going to get fancy, and I was going to try to use the kickboard like a surfboard. So, I'm pushing it into the water and trying to step my feet on top of it and then let go, and as it rises up, try to keep my balance on it. And I was not succeeding. So every time that it didn't work, I wasn't noticing that I was kind of getting pushed further and further out, closer to that rope that goes across the middle of the pool right before it dips way down into the deep end. And so this next time, I get on the board and I lose my balance, but the board completely flies out from under my feet. So it's nowhere within my reach to grab it, and I crash into the water. So I'm flailing my arms around in the pool, trying to keep my head above the water, but I start getting tired and I can't touch. It's too deep. So now all of a sudden, my flailing to keep my head above water turns into underwater, push up, take a breath, underwater, push up, take a breath, and then finally, I'm just underwater. And I start sinking down and down into the pool, and I remember my little child brain thinking, this is it. It's over for me. It was a good, 4-year run, whatever, but it's over. And this is kind of the spot that we last left our character, Jonah, in this story. We've been going through the book of Jonah, and so the first week I kind of just set the stage for us, and I talked about how a lot of times when we think we are running for our lives, we're actually running from our lives. And so Jonah, he had this set idea, this set vision of how he saw things, and he was running for that, but in reality, he was running from the life that God wanted for him. He was running from this amazing experience of God's outpouring of love and mercy that he could be a part of. And a lot of times for us, we live the same way. We are chasing after our vision of life, but really we are missing out. We're running from this life that God desires for us. And then last week, Andrew started breaking down chapter 1 of Jonah. And so we read the story about Jonah, who's a prophet. He receives a message from God. He takes it to the people. So God says to Jonah, hey, I want you to go preach to the people of Nineveh. But the people in Nineveh are wicked, and they've done some things to really hurt Jonah's people. And so Jonah runs in the opposite direction, away from God. And so he gets on this boat to sail away, and there's this big storm that comes. And eventually he tells the people on the boat, throw me overboard. And he does, and the storm stops. And Andrew kind of talked about how God pursues the people that we flee, because Jonah was running away from Nineveh, but everything God was doing was pursuing to bring mercy to the people of Nineveh, and Jonah was going against that. And so we ended chapter 1 with Jonah getting swallowed by a fish. And so you think, the end, right? What a depressing story. That's a terrible way to die. We think that's the end of the story. But remember what I said, that even at our lowest point, God can raise us up. So then we turn to chapter 2, which is where we're going to be tonight, and we're thrown this major curveball that Jonah is alive inside the fish. Like, what? And what is he doing in the fish? Like, he's like trying to figure out how to get out of the fish, right? No. He's composing like beautiful, brilliant Hebrew poetry in the fish. What a strange story this is. Like, it's an odd story, but this story reveals some of our worst tendencies as humans, but it also reveals the perfect and loving and full of grace and mercy character of God. And we see that even at our lowest points, God can raise us up. So, Jonah chapter 2, starting with verse 1. If you got a Bible, you can follow along. I've got it on the screen behind us. Here we go. From inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. Okay, can we just talk about this for a second? If you've been tracing along in the story so far, think about this. At the beginning, God speaks to Jonah. He says, hey, I want you to go to Nineveh. I want you to preach to the people there. First of all, Jonah doesn't say anything back to God. He just ignores him. Rude. But then, on top of that, he goes in the opposite direction. Like, he runs away. And then he's on the ship, and like the storm has come in, and the sailors are saying to Jonah, hey, Jonah, please pray to your God that we would be spared. And again, Jonah ignores them. He doesn't say anything. This whole time, Jonah has been completely silent. He hasn't said a single word to God. And if we're honest, he's really gotten himself into this mess. Like, if he would have just done what he was supposed to do in the first place, none of this would be the case. But he's run away from God. He's making one bad decision after another. And he's gotten himself into this mess. And now that he's inside the fish, he's ready to pray to God. Like, oh, Jonah, now you're ready to talk to me, right? And I just kind of wonder, like, how often do we do that? How often are we exactly like this? We go about our lives and we're completely ignoring God. He's speaking to us. We're not listening. We're not saying anything back. We're going in the opposite direction of him. And then all of a sudden, life happens. We get ourselves in a mess. Half the time it's like Jonah, it's our own fault. We've made a series of bad decisions. We have no one to blame but ourselves. And now all of a sudden that we're in this bad point, it's like, oh, now I'm ready to talk to God. Now I need God to bail me out of this. And this is the situation that Jonah's in. So, what does he say? Jonah chapter 2, verse 2. In my distress, I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From deep in the realm of the dead, I called for help, and you listened to my cry. So here's Jonah. He's in this mess. He's brought it on himself. He's been ignoring God, running in the opposite direction this whole time. And now all of a sudden that he's in the fish, he's ready to talk to God. And how does God respond? Is God like, hey, Jonah, I'm going to give you a taste of your own medicine. I'm going to ignore you, just like you ignored me. Or is God like, you had your chance, man. Like, deal with it. You're on your own. No. It says that God answered him, that God heard his cry. This story reveals our worst tendencies as humans, but also this perfect and loving character of God who is full of grace and mercy. And we see that even at our lowest point, God can raise us up. So as we continue into chapter 2, now what Jonah's going to do is he's going to kind of recount for us this story of what happened between when he gets thrown overboard and when this fish comes toward him. So here's what he says, starting in verse 3. You hurled me into the depths, into the very heart of the seas, and the currents swirled around me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. I said, I have been banished from your sight. Yet I will look again toward your holy temple. The engulfing waters threatened me. The deep surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. To the roots of the mountains I sank down. The earth beneath barred me in forever. Last week, Andrew, he was talking a lot about the down language in the beginning of Jonah. And so he said that as you're reading this, like every time Jonah goes a direction, it's always down. So he goes down to Joppa, and he goes down into this boat, and then he goes down below the boat to sleep, and then he gets thrown off the boat down into the sea, and it's always down. And now in chapter 2, like this really hits its peak. And so Jonah, he's thrown into the depths of the water. Like the waves are crashing all around him. He's surrounded by the deep, and then he starts to sink. And it says he goes down, and he sinks down further and further to the point where it says he's at the roots of the mountains. Like he has hit the bottom of the sea floor, and like the earth is starting to go over him. And so Jonah, he has literally sunk down so far, like that you literally can't sink down anymore, as far as you possibly can go. And maybe, like for us, we can relate to that in our lives. And we even use the same language. We say things like, man, I can't believe that he would sink so low. Or she's really in a downward spiral. Or, man, they've really gone downhill. I'm at a really low point in my life. Like I finally hit rock bottom, right? And we just feel in life like we're sinking further and further. And what Jonah says in verse 4 is so powerful. He says, I have been banished from your sight. And what that word banished means, what it's trying to convey is this idea of having no point of return, no option to return. And so Jonah, he thinks he's gotten exactly what he wanted. Like at the beginning of the story, he's trying to run away from where God is going. And he thinks as he's in this moment, like, that's what I've gotten. Like God has left me. And there's no possible way that I can return. Like he says that there's no going back for me. I've been banished from God, and he's literally kind of resigning to this fact that he is done for. And maybe you've been there before. Or maybe you're there like right now in your life. And you see that you have run from God and you are just sinking lower and lower and lower, and you feel like there's no possible way for you to return. Like God can never take you back. And we even use this language like, I feel like I'm drowning in life. But even in our lowest points, God can raise us up. So there I was in the pool, sinking to the bottom, thinking it's over, like it's done for me. And all of a sudden I heard like this splash of water. And so from under the pool, I turn over and I see this blurry object coming toward me, like blurry white top, blurry red bottoms. And these arms reach out and grab around me. And all of a sudden, this downward sinking that I've been doing starts to go up. And I see the top of the water like start to get closer and closer, and I can start to see now the reflections of people up there. And then finally, my face breaks through the surface, like oxygen. I can feel sunlight on my face. The lifeguard had been watching. He had seen what happened, and he jumped in the pool, and he grabbed me, and he brought me up out of the water. And so here's Jonah, who has like very literally hit rock bottom. He's at the bottom of the sea floor. He has gone down to the point that like there's no more down left to go. He thinks he's been banished from God, that there's no return for him. And then the climax of the story, guys, comes in verse 6. Where we read, but you, Lord my God, brought my life up from the pit. Even at our lowest point, God can raise us up. And here, the language completely changes. Remember, I said every thing Jonah does, the direction has been down and down and down until he sunk to his lowest point. But here, God steps in and raises his life up. And now when you read the rest of the chapter, all the words are different. Listen to this. When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose up to you, to your holy temple. Those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them. But I, with shouts of grateful praise, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will make good. I will say salvation comes from the Lord. And the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited, yes, that is the exact word used, Jonah up onto dry land. Everything changes when God steps in, and now everything goes from down to up for Jonah. So 2 things that stick out to me tonight for us to take home from this chapter of Jonah. The first is this: how do we respond when we are in the depths, when we're sinking, when we've hit the bottom, when we are in the fish? Like sometimes for us when we're there, it is like Jonah, if we're honest. It's our fault. We have sinned, we have run away from God, we have made one bad decision after another, and we are the ones to blame for the situation we're in. But sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes we're there because it's someone else's fault. Like maybe you are in the mess right now because your parents are deciding to get a divorce, and that has nothing to do with you. That's not your decision, but you're still affected by it. Or sometimes things just happen. People get sick. We lose people that we love. But whatever the reason, I still believe it's true that even in those low points, God can raise us up. And the question is, when we're there, how do we respond? Because here's what I think is really interesting. When we read about Jonah being in the fish, like what is he saying? You think he would be saying like, God, get me out of this fish, right? Like, what in the world? I don't want to be here anymore. But that's not what he's saying. He never mentions the fish one time. Instead, while he is in there, he's worshiping. He is giving shouts of grateful praise. He is actually thanking God while he's inside this fish. He says things like, I will look to your temple. He's saying, God, I remember who you are. I remember your promises in this moment. He says, I thought I had been banished from you, God, with no option of return, but now he's realizing that God's presence is with him. Like it never left him. And so my question is, what kinds of things do we remember when we are in the depths? Do we still choose to worship? Do we still choose to offer thanks to God? Do we remember his promises? Do we remember who he is? How do we respond when we're in the depths? And the second thing that I want us to take away tonight, I've said it a bunch of times, I'm going to say it again, is that even when we are at our lowest point, God can raise us up. Like think about this. If Jonah had sunk to the lowest possible point on earth, and God was able to raise him up, he can do the same for you. He can do the same in your life. And so here's what's so crazy about the story is we have the privilege of having the vantage point with where the story goes. And when I say that, I don't just mean where the story of Jonah goes, I mean with where the whole story of Scripture is going. Because see, there's this one time where Jesus is talking to the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, and they ask him for a sign. And here's how he responds. Let me read it to you. It says, he answered, a wicked and adulterous generation asks for a sign, but none will be given it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The men of Nineveh will stand up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, for they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and now something greater than Jonah is here. So Jesus refers to the sign of Jonah, and here's what I think that means. when we read at the end of chapter 1 that Jonah is swallowed by a fish, we think for sure that is the end. Like, if you were to read a story that someone got eaten by a shark, your first thought wouldn't be that they're still alive, right? Like, we think it's over. But in this story, something that was supposed to be a place of death is used as a place of deliverance. Like, God uses this fish to save Jonah, not to kill him. And in the same way, Jesus going to the cross makes a place that was meant for death a place of deliverance. And even the same language is used here. Like, Jesus goes down into the grave, but he rises up from the dead. And now, like, that gives us hope of salvation. We are told that because of that, the same can be true for us, that even at our lowest points, God can raise us up. And so we see this language all over the Bible. Like, in Christ, we're a new creation, that, we are raised with Christ. So even at our lowest points, God can raise us up. And then at the end of chapter 2, Jonah says, salvation comes from the Lord. And ultimately, the Lord has brought that through Jesus. So as the band comes up on the stage tonight, I want you to consider this. When you think about these different stages of Jonah, like, is there one of them that you are in? Maybe you resonate with one of these. Like, maybe you're in this phase kind of at the beginning of silence, where you're like, man, I have been ignoring God. I've not been communicating with God. I've been going in the opposite direction. And instead of waiting until you've sunk to the lowest point to finally reach out to God, maybe tonight it's time to break the silence, to restore the relationship. Or maybe right now, you are in the deep, like you are sinking, and you need to remember tonight that God can raise you up. If God can bring deliverance out of what was made for death, then he can bring redemption out of your situation as well. And that doesn't mean that everything's going to be perfect. That doesn't mean everything's going to go back to normal. That doesn't mean it's not still going to hurt. But I have seen story after story after story of people who have been in these awful situations, whether their fault or of no fault of their own, but God has still been able to raise them up. Like, God has still been able to bring some good out of that situation. Maybe tonight you just need to ask God, how? How is that happening? God, I need you to bring my life up out of the pit. Maybe tonight you just need to remember some things about God while you're in the deep. It's easy to worship. It's easy to give thanks. It's easy to remember the promises of God when everything's going great, but not so much when we're sinking. Not so much when we're in the fish. And so tonight, like, if that's you, maybe you need, even in the midst of the deeps, to offer some worship to God, offer thanks to him, to remember his promises, remember who he says he is. And that's what we're going to do now as we go into our time of worship. Maybe tonight you need to remember that even at our lowest point, God can raise us up. So why don't you guys stand up? I want to pray for you. And then we're going to go into a time of response. So let's pray. God, we thank you for who you are. We thank you for your word and the way that it speaks truth to us. And God, I just pray that tonight that we would just remember this simple, short, yet powerful phrase, that even when we are at our lowest points, that you can raise us up. That ultimately, through what you've done in Jesus, that you can restore us as well. So I just pray just that we would see that tonight and as we leave here this week. It's in Jesus' name we pray.